Donald Trump is throwing a historic tantrum in response to the Supreme Court ruling that his tariff plan was blatantly unconstitutional. In response to that, Trump is freaking out. He's referring to Supreme Court justices, including ones he handpicked, as traitors, claiming that there's a foreign influence campaign afoot, and saying that he'll just institute higher unilateral tariffs anyways, regardless of what the Supreme Court or Congress says. He's also going after specific Republicans, and there's no answer as to whether any American companies, or least of all the Americans themselves, will see any refunds as a result of these tariffs being overruled. But it's sure to be something that Trump will discuss at his State of the Union address on Tuesday. And if you don't want to have to listen to Trump ramble on and on about the Supreme Court that betrayed him, may I suggest that you instead turn your attention to some counter programming that Courier is putting on in partnership with Defiance.org. It's called The State of the Swamp, and you can use discount code Courier15 to gain access. When Trump found out that the Supreme Court had voted down his unconstitutional tariffs, he reacted like any 5-year-old who was told they couldn't get their favorite cereal at the grocery store would. He threw a tantrum and said that despite this ruling, he's going to unilaterally declare and raise tariffs on countries around the world from 10% to 15%. Of course, he has no authority to actually do this, but it's a classic Trump maneuver. He'll never admit that he was wrong, and in fact, he'll just claim that he's doing it anyways, even if he legally can't. This is what Trump posted on Truth Social over the weekend. He said, based on a thorough, detailed, and complete review of the ridiculous, poorly written, and extraordinarily anti-American decision on tariffs issued yesterday, after many months of contemplation by the United States Supreme Court, please let this statement serve to represent that I, as President of the United States of America, will be, effective immediately, raising the 10% worldwide tariffs on countries, many of which have been ripping the US off for decades without retribution until I came along, to the fully allowed and legally tested 15% level. Now, this is literally a fantasy that's not going to happen. US Customs and Border Patrol announced that they would immediately halt collection of tariffs in response to this Supreme Court ruling, and with Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent telling CNN that lower courts will have to weigh in on potential tariff refunds that may be issued in response to this ruling. Now, despite what Trump has said about tariffs making Americans richer, the truth is that tariffs have already made American consumers poorer, because on average, American households have had to shoulder thousands more in costs related to these tariffs, which are a tax on importers of goods from other countries. And now that those tariffs have been deemed unconstitutional, those fees that have been collected over the past year, totaling over $134 billion, leaves CNN with the following headline: the $135 billion question, who will get a tariff refund? But as the article goes on to report, it won't be nearly as easy for these 300,000 businesses to recoup any of these tariff fees as it was to get the Supreme Court to rule that obviously this was an unconstitutional move from the beginning. Trump is saying that the Constitution protects his ability to install these tariffs, but the reality is that Congress gets to decide whether or not we have these types of tariffs. And that's a constitutional overstep that Trump has been making for more than a year now. But CNN reports that on Friday, when Trump was asked about these businesses getting refunds, he said, I guess it has to get litigated for the next 2 years, maybe even the next 5 years. CNN reports that likely means that businesses will have to fight tooth and nail for any chance at a refund, even though the government kept meticulous records of all tariff payments. A lot of them are just going to have to file lawsuits, which is a costly and expensive process that may or may not get results. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent went on to say, it won't be a problem if we have to do it, but I can tell you that if it happens, which I don't think it's going to, it's just a corporate boondoggle. And at an event hosted by the Economic Club of Dallas, he went on to say, I've got a feeling the American people won't see it. Economist Stephanie Roth said companies are highly unlikely to start trimming their prices as a result. Walmart is not going to give you a check for the 15% tariff on sneakers you bought from them 4 months ago. So, all of those increased prices that consumers encountered as a result of these tariffs, higher prices at the grocery store, higher prices on retail items, and significantly higher prices on goods made overseas, like custom wedding gowns, as just one example. Well, all of those costs are basically already eaten, and you're never going to get that money back. So, this grand plan that Trump had to make billions of dollars for Americans actually just ended up costing Americans thousands of extra dollars at a time of extreme economic uncertainty and strife for no reason whatsoever. Instead, the US federal government made billions of dollars that they may or may not even have to return, and not until Trump might be out of office. And what did the federal government spend all of this money on? Well, if we look at a breakdown of federal expenses from last year, we can see that most of the expenses have to do with these mandatory costs. Things like Medicaid, Social Security, Medicare, and other mandatory federal expenses. But a significant chunk, 27%, goes to discretionary spending. And of that portion of the pie, we have 13% of the federal budget going to defense funding. Defense spending goes toward things including ICE, Customs and Border Control, as well as immigrations and customs enforcement, like the brutal occupation of American cities that has been terrorizing Americans for the past year. So the tariffs are unconstitutional, but the money that the Trump administration made from those tariffs is going right back into policies that are deeply unpopular and hurt all Americans. But Trump, the authoritarian leader who's best compared to a petulant child, didn't just stop there. In his tantrum, he also pledged to take whatever measures he could to even destroy other countries if he can't place tariffs on them. Specifically, at a White House presser, Trump said, "The good news is that there are methods, practices, statutes, and authorities as recognized by the entire court in this terrible decision, and also as recognized by Congress, which they refer to, that are even stronger than the IEEPA tariffs available to me as the President of the United States." He said, "We have alternatives, great alternatives. Could be more money. We'll take in more money and we'll be a lot stronger for it. We're taking in hundreds of billions of dollars, which the American people will never see. Will continue to do so." To show you how ridiculous the opinion is, however, the court said that I'm not allowed to charge even $1. Trump went on to ramble and he said, "But I am allowed to cut off any and all trade or business with that same country. In other words, I can destroy the trade. I can destroy the country. I'm even allowed to impose a foreign country destroying embargo. I can embargo, I can do anything I want, but I can't charge $1. Because that's not what it says, and that's the way it even reads. I can do anything I wanted to do to them, but can't charge any money. So I'm allowed to destroy the country, but it can't be a little fee. I could give them a little two-cent fee." How ridiculous is that? I'm allowed to embargo them. I'm allowed to tell them, "You can't do business in the United States anymore. We want you out of here." But if I want to charge them $10, I can't do that. It's incorrect. Their decision is incorrect, but it doesn't matter because we have very powerful alternatives that have been approved by this decision. They've been approved for those that thought they had us. And they're saying that I have the absolute right to license, but not the right to charge a license fee. So think of that. A lot of what he's saying here is, of course, totally nonsensical. Trump doesn't understand how to read a Supreme Court ruling. But the logic on display here is one of total narcissism. His chief concern is what he feels he's allowed to do versus what he feels he's unfairly not allowed to do. Even though if he could read and comprehend, he would know that the Constitution never allowed him to impose these tariffs in the first place. But he's having a classic narcissistic crash out. And Trump doesn't care who he threatens or who he hurts or what kind of message this sends to the rest of the countries around the world, since he's threatening to destroy them for no other reason than he wasn't given exactly what he wanted by the Supreme Court he thinks he can control. Trump even claimed that the Supreme Court has been corrupted by outside foreign influences. a charge that he has no evidence to substantiate, but he's just lashing out because they told him no. Ironically, the two conservative SCOTUS judges who ultimately made it so that Trump's tariffs were deemed unconstitutional are people that Trump himself installed in previous terms: Neil Gorsuch and Amy Coney Barrett. But Trump lashed out at them again for not doing everything that he pleased. And the Daily Beast reports that Neil Gorsuch had some choice words for his fellow Supreme Court justices on both sides of the aisle. Gorsuch called out his fellow Supreme Court justices for what he claims is inconsistency around the major questions doctrine, which the Daily Beast writes states that a policy of major national significance must be enacted with clear congressional support. Gorsuch pointed to the dissenting conservative judges in this case, Clarence Thomas, Samuel Alito, and Brett Kavanaugh, and said still others who have joined major questions decisions in the past dissent from today's application of the doctrine. He also criticized the liberal judges Sonia Sotomayor, Elena Kagan, and Ketanji Brown Jackson, whom the Daily Beast reports he similarly believes were inconsistent about the doctrine. Gorsuch wrote, "Past critics of the major questions doctrine do not object to its application in this case, and they even join much of today's principal opinion. But they insist they can reach the same result by employing only routine tools of statutory interpretation." But Trump doesn't really care about any of that, nor can he really understand it. For Trump, the only clear logic is whether someone is on his team and submitting to his desires and wishes, or if they aren't. And if they aren't, he's going to punish them, or at least try to, regardless of any logic or reason, because he operates on a purely personal pejorative. That's why he's pulling his endorsement from a Republican lawmaker over what he claims is a lack of support for his tariffs. That would be Republican Colorado Representative Jim Hurd, who Trump says he is withdrawing his support from. Instead, Trump is throwing his support behind Hurd's competitor, which is a move that he's employed in the past with varying degrees of success. But what all of this goes to show is that Trump's tariffs policies were never about the country as a whole or about serving his constituents. It was only ever about trying to bend the country to his will, because the reality is tariffs don't help anyone. They just boost Trump's ego. He thinks they're a good idea, and so therefore anyone who disagrees or anyone who tries to stop him becomes an enemy, whether they're a Republican lawmaker, a liberal opponent, or even one of the Supreme Court justices that Trump himself nominated for the position. Trump is incapable of feeling or expressing shame, so instead he just lashes out. And I'm sure we will hear much more about how all of these people betrayed him during his State of the Union address tomorrow. But if you don't want to have to sit there and listen to Trump ramble on and on about the betrayal, instead, maybe you should tune into the counter programming that Courier is co hosting with Defiance.org, the state of the swamp. You can use code Courier15 for a discount to view. I hope to see you there. In the meantime, it's going to be a very long time before we find out if anyone is entitled to a refund after Trump's disastrous tariff policies that have cost Americans thousands upon thousands of dollars.